Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Conway Hall, where ethics matter. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to have as our guest Guy Standing. He is British Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He's also the co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network. I'm sure we've all noticed that there are rapidly growing numbers of people who are facing lives of insecurity, 0 hours contracts, moving in and out of jobs that give little meaning to their lives. In his new book, The Precariat, Guy Standing investigates this frustrated and angry new underclass. Thank you very much, Guy.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for coming on a Sunday afternoon. There are always high opportunity costs on a Sunday afternoon, so I appreciate your being here. It's also a suitable place to be talking about the precariat in the sense that many radicals of the past have lived near here, including, for 3 years, one of my heroes who's been very influential in the way I've been thinking about what I'm going to be talking about, which was William Morris, who lived in the square, and I'd like to pay tribute to him because he's been a very influential force in my life. We are in the eye of the storm. This is an existential crisis we're facing, and it's a transformational crisis. When I wrote the first edition of The Precariat, which was published in early 2011, I wrote on page 1 that unless the insecurities and aspirations of the precariat were understood and translated into political strategy, we would see the emergence of an ugly monster. Those precise words. Now, the book has been translated into 23 languages, which doesn't happen to a sort of boring economist, but has happened. And on November 2016, I received a deluge of emails from people around the world in various languages and so on, saying, "Your monster has arrived." And of course, it was Donald Trump. And we, in a sense, have been fortunate because had it not been for COVID, the only good thing I can think of COVID is that had it not been for COVID, he would probably have been re-elected as President of the United States. And even after his mismanagement and atrocious statements and everything during the pandemic, he still got 74 million votes. It was a close-run thing. And there will be other neo-fascists around who will be cleverer than Donald Trump. And we are seeing politics in this country and elsewhere drifting in the same direction, where unless we have a new politics of paradise, as described in the book, we are in danger of drifting in that direction. We need a new progressive politics with a new vocabulary, a new set of images, a new understanding of what it is that we're confronting. And as long as politicians refer to a free market economy failing, we will not confront the enemy correctly. We do not have a free market system. In fact, what neoliberalism has constructed is the most unfree market economy ever conceived. The original architects, the Mont Pelerin Society, represented by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, were neoliberals. They believed that freeing the markets, individualism, privatizing everything that could be privatized, commodifying everything that could be commodified, would lead to a situation where you get a wonderful nirvana of a market economy. But the first thing they did, you will remember the Big Bang, was financial liberalization. There has never been labour market deregulation. The number of academics who have referred to labour market deregulation is just shocking, because what has been happening is re-regulation in the interests of capital and against the interests of the group I'm going to be talking about. But financialization, launched in the 1980s, has created a situation where finance controls the whole global economy. Today, incredibly, the financial assets of financial institutions come to over 1,000% of GDP in this country. And in most other rich countries, it's over 500%. So essentially, it's a simple question of the tail wagging the economic dog. And you will see that countless politicians in positions of top seniority in government after government come from Goldman Sachs, one firm. What is the probability of prime ministers, governors of the central banks of different countries, and finance ministers all coming from the same company, Goldman Sachs? It should be no surprise that the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sunak, he spent his formative years in Goldman Sachs. The governors of the Bank of England spent their formative years in Goldman Sachs, in Wall Street. And you can go on and on and on, as one of my books has listed. Now, rentier capitalism, which has developed in this period, is the real enemy. And what this means is that more and more of the income and wealth is transferred to the owners of property. Physical property, financial property, intellectual property. And governments have been giving more and more of social spending to benefits of property owners. Huge subsidies, vast subsidies. And of course, finance has moved through the economy to make sure more and more people, more and more of us, are in debt. Because that's how they make their money. It's nothing profound about that. They want us to all be in debt because they make their money that way. Now, I don't have time to talk about the contours of rentier capitalism because I want to talk about the critical outcome. And the critical outcome is the growth of a new global class structure. Now, in the original version of the book, I had actually written about the growth of the Precariat quite often beforehand in another book a number of years earlier, and it sold hardly anything, dead in the water. So I wanted to write this book to reach people who were not necessarily economists, but who could understand what the realities are. So this book was written for lay people who were interested in what was going on. And the new global class structure has been superimposed on previous class structures, and we have a plutocracy, not the top 1%, it's the top 0.001%, who make billions while they sleep. Billions. So, of course, during the financial crash, these billionaire plutocrats, their incomes and wealth went up and up and up, where everybody else was suffering. During the pandemic last year, you've probably all seen the figures. They've made extra billions and billions, while the group I'm about to talk about saw their living standards crashing. It's going on and on and on. And the plutocracy are global citizens with rights wherever they choose them, and they increasingly penetrated the media, penetrated the institutions, have revolving doors between finance and politics, etc. So we have a crisis of our democracy because it is not a democracy. It is ruled by and for the interests of the plutocrats and the elites below them. But below them, in terms of a class structure, is the group that I call in the book the Precariat. Now, when I was a student, we were told, we presumed, when I was studying economics, that by the end of the 20th century, the vast majority of us would be in the salariat. That is, have employment security, have prospect of a pension, paid holidays, paid this, paid that, and labour security. But of course, the salariat has been shrinking all over the world. And increasingly, people in the salariat are worried about one thing above all else. And that is their sons and daughters will not be entering the salariat, they'll be entering the precariat. And in many places where I've given a talk, some elderly person will come up at the end and say, I want 2 copies of your book. I say, why? I want one for my daughter and one for my son. The salariat is shrinking and is also detached from the welfare system, but is detached from the labour regulations, is not quite sure which interests to back, but actually have been making a lot of money from rentier capital, through stocks and shares, property prices, etc. So they are torn politically, probably support a conservative in the end, but a lot of them are open for a different agenda. Below the salariat is the old proletariat. I had the honour, I believe it's an honour and I treat it as such, of being the economic advisor to John McDonnell for 3 years up to the last election. And I said, John, don't couch your rhetoric in terms of the old working class. It's not there. It's a dwindling proportion of the total, the proletariat, that has roots in manual labour in the big industries, the steel industry, the car industry, or whatever. Yes, that would be nice for their support, but that's not the future, and that's not the majority today. And increasingly, people in the proletariat fear they're going to fall into the precariat beneath them. Now, what is the precariat? Because the precariat today, I believe, is 40% or more of the total labour force. Just done calculations for Germany, and surprisingly in Germany it's probably more than that. It's defined in class terms in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is that it has distinctive relations of production. To use a Marxian term, but you don't have to be a Marxist or use a Marxian term. What that means is it has a pattern of work and labour that is very distinctive. If you are in the precariat, you are being habituated to accept a life of unstable labour, insecure labour. I hate the term precarious work, for a reason that should become clear in a few minutes. It is not precarious work we're talking about. Insecure labour and unstable labour are distinctive in themselves. More importantly than that is that if you're in the precariat, you have no occupational narrative to give to your life. I am becoming something. I am something. Or to my children and my grandchildren, I was something. You're living bits and pieces lives. And you have no narrative of a corporation or a sector, because you could be moving around like this. And remarkably, and this is why one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you, Alan, to today's session, is that you have a situation where if you're in the precariat, you have to do a hell of a lot of work for labour, work that isn't recognised as work, work that isn't remunerated and isn't in our statistics, but you have to do it, because if you don't do it, you pay a heavy price. You have to do more and more work to reproduce your skills, your attitudes. You have to do more and more work of waiting around, filling in forms, satisfying people. You have to do more work, and therefore the wage you're earning is actually an overstatement of what it should be as in terms of a wage rate, in terms of the time you put into it. And of course, something that every group of the precariat that I've ever addressed understand you have a level of labour that's below the level of your education or schooling. And that creates its own frustrations, its own lack of status, and so on. The second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. What that means is that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages. They don't get that paid holiday, they don't get the non-wage benefit, the maternity leave, the paternity leave, or the prospect of a pension. They're losing those. And many of the developments that have taken place in the last 30 years have been effectively concession bargains that have been a deception, because they've given up certain type of benefit in return for a modest increase in their money wage. So if you look only at money wages, you think, well, they haven't done too badly. But actually it means that they've lost a standard of living, because those benefits are worth a very high percentage of total pay. But this, interestingly, is the first mass class in history which is being exploited outside the workplace, outside labour, through mechanisms of rent seeking. I was picked up by an Uber driver yesterday, and my publisher arranged me a special Uber driver, and I had a long chat with him. I've not been in a Uber before, and he told me how much the Uber take. I did know the figure, it's in the book, but I was interested to get his take on it. He said, well, it goes from 25% to 50%. And all these app-driven people are paying a wedge. It's a form of labor broker that amounts to 50% in the Amazon Turk situation, the cloud labor, and what I call the concierge economy. That rental wedge is 50%. So you've got to take that into account, of course, in thinking of their wages. But we have a situation where finance puts everybody in the precariat, if it can, into levels of debt that are verging on the unsustainable. And what that means is that at any financial crash, any pandemic, any shock to the system, and millions of people are potentially homeless, food bank candidates, etc., etc. We all know the stories. So you've got a system which is based on deliberate economic insecurity. Everybody knows this is happening to the precariat, right? But there's something new which I hadn't emphasized at all, a little bit, in the first edition, but which is much more in the current edition. And that is that we are in an era of economic uncertainty. And for an economist, uncertainty is a special form of insecurity. With the time of Beveridge, design of the welfare state after the Second World War, it was a matter of saying that there were certain contingency risks, the term that was used, which you could develop social insurance. I can calculate the probability that you become unemployed. I can calculate the probability where you become sick. I can calculate the probability that you become pregnant. Not quite your case, but you know what I mean. You can calculate the probability, and therefore you can build up a system of insurance. With uncertainty, it's about unknown unknowns. And we are in an era where we are facing chronic uncertainty. We don't know when we're going to be hit. We don't know the degree of the shock. It's called in the literature black swans. A black swan is very rare and the impact can be quite dramatic. But now we're facing a bevy of black swans. One pandemic, this is already the 6th pandemic this century. And there have been 500 plus financial crises across the world since the beginning of the neoliberal era. So we're living in a situation where you can't rely on the old forms of a Beveridge welfare system. You need ex ante protection, not ex post compensation for the realization of a predictable shock. And that, of course, has relevance for the arguments for basic income, which is the key theme of all my work. Now, the third dimension is the most important of all. And however many times I have said this in the last decade, there will be at least one journalist who goes and writes that Standing says that the Precariat is all about unstable labour. And again and again and again I say, no, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the Precariat has distinctive relations with the state. It is in the process, it's the first class in history, it's in the process of losing the rights of citizenship, losing civil rights, losing social rights, losing political rights, because it doesn't see in the political spectrum a party or politicians representing its interests. It is losing cultural rights and is losing common rights. And that process leads to the biggest single aspect of being in the Precariat. You feel like a supplicant. The original Latin for precarious, the roots of the term, is to obtain by prayer. And that is what it is like to be in the Precariat. I cannot tell you how many people have written to me to say that about their own lives. Being a supplicant means you have to rely on people making discretionary judgments in your favor, doing you a favor, asking for help, asking for a decision, asking for benevolence from somebody. And this, of course, is pity. Please show me pity. And we all know from David Hume that pity is akin to contempt. And if you're in the Precariat and you're an ordinary intelligent person, you know that. You know that. And therefore you feel angry. And that leads to the 4 A's discussed in the book. The 4 A's are, first of all, if you're in the Precariat, you suffer from what the sociologists say is anomie. Anomie means a feeling of despair, a feeling that you're not being able to get out of what you are in. That sense of anomie induces a sense of abjection, a sense of giving up, a sense of why bother, a sense of must be my fault, I must blame myself, I'm not competent, I'm not good enough. Which of course has been a big factor in the huge increase in opioids, a huge increase of deaths of despair, of suicidal tendencies that has taken place in the last decade or more. Anybody who denies these things is a bastard. And we should be standing up and basically saying, these are the realities, and these realities are not the failures of individuals, they are failures of a system that is producing the conditions that contribute to their growth. This sense of anomie and objection is there. The second of A is, of course, anxiety. If you feel chronically insecure, all the behavioral problems multiply. People who feel insecure, their mental bandwidth shrinks. Psychologists have told us that. You'd have thought it was obvious, but the psychologists have demonstrated again and again and again. So how can the politicians demand us to behave with social responsibility if the conditions have produced a diminishing amount of capacity to reason and act rationally? That sense of anxiety is increased by the uncertainty that I've talked about. And the third, or obvious one, is a sense of alienation. If you're in the Precariat, you have to do a lot of things you don't want to do. And there are a lot of things you would like to do that you can't do. That's the ultimate form of alienation. And alienation goes with a sort of status frustration effect If you are educated and you can't do what your education enables you to be able to do, you're going to be starting to feel very alienated altogether. And these first three A's lead, of course, to the fourth A, and that is anger. Now, out there's a hell of a lot of anger. And that anger is growing, and it will be growing much more because of the COVID. It's built up anger. But the problem has been in the last decade that the precariat has been a class in the making, not yet a class for itself. That's another Marxian term. If it offends anybody, I apologize. But in that sense that there's a class in the making, like the proletariat was in the 19th century. For a long period, it is internally divided. And what I said in the books was that the first group is called the atavists. These are people in the precariat who've fallen out of old working class communities or families. They don't have a lot of education, and they think they've lost yesterday. They want yesterday back. So this group listens to the Donald Trumps promising to bring back, make America great. This group listens to the Boris Johnson, we're going to restore sovereignty, blah, blah, blah. And they go with authoritarian instincts sold to them, sirens luring them onto the rocks, proverbially. The good news, and I couldn't say this in 2011, but I can say it in 2021, the good news is the size of that group has passed its peak. Many of those people are going into retirement and fading out of the scene because the old proletariat shrank a long time ago. The second group has grown a lot. I call it the nostalgics. The first group feel they've lost the past. They want the past back. The second group is the migrants, the minorities, the ethnic groups, the disabled, who feel they've lost the present. They don't have a home anywhere. This group keeps their heads down, a few days of rage, but they're looking for something new. But they won't vote for neo-fascist populists. They just don't vote. They're disenfranchised. And that's a huge proportion of the total, and we've seen it around the world. It's the third group that is growing, and where I move into a sphere of optimism. And that's what I call the progressives. These are mostly the young, many more women than men probably, who were promised that if they went to school and university and college and got a degree, they would have a future, a career, great things, great money, etc. And they come out and they know they've been sold a lottery ticket and they are wallowing in insecurity, etc., etc., etc. Their anger won't lead them to vote for a neo-fascist populism. Their anger will lead them to demand a new politics of paradise, as the book describes it. And one of the great disappointments of the past decade is that politics of paradise has not emerged. For a while, it seemed that the elements were moving in a good direction, I felt. We need a new ecologically driven sense of the Enlightenment, but it's been stillborn again and again and again with politicians trying to return to the old normal. And this situation, this stasis that we've got today, has revealed what I'm sorry to say. I was asked to talk at two events at the Labour Party conference in Brighton last week before, and I saw it there. I said, if you don't identify the enemy, and you don't identify the potentially progressive parts of the population, you can't possibly come up with a solution that makes sense and appeals. You're going nowhere. It's senseless. They're hoping, of course, that the Tories will move to the point of idiocy where enough people will just say something a little bit better is acceptable. That's a terrible prescription. A terrible prescription. But it's not arguing for revolution to be saying what I'm saying. It's arguing for saying, okay, get the perspective of your new mass class, get the perspective of what your enemy is, and then forging an agenda that mobilizes not only the progressive part of the Precariat, but other groups. I've written a book, and there are a few copies there, called Plunder of the Commons. The loss of the commons in the last decade, particularly through the austerity era, is something that is really shattering British society. And if it's any consolation, it's shattering other societies as well. But if I talk about reviving the commons, because the commons is needed by the Precariat more than any other group, you will quickly get an alliance between people who are in the salariat, people who are even in the elite, and parts of the Precariat for saying, yeah, we want this as part of our agenda. One of the beauties, as Barb here has been a fellow traveller and colleague will testify, one of the few beauties of this past year and a half has been that suddenly people in their millions around the world, and the Precariat most of all, have suddenly understood that we need a new income distribution system that takes that rent back for society and that gives people a basic income, that will deal with the insecurities, that will deal with the need for freedom. I have been incredibly touched that people all over the world have suddenly realized the following simple fact, which I did as the key line of a thing I did with Massive Attack last summer. The resilience of all of us depends on the resilience of the most vulnerable amongst us. And this pandemic has taught us, surely, we're all vulnerable. We are all lacking in resilience. And unless we have a system of giving people basic security, basic freedom, we will continue to be fragile as society. We will continue to see the inequalities multiply. And we will continue to see the emergence of Trumps and Johnsons and others of their ilk. That's why my starting point was that we are at a critical moment in this crisis. And it leads to the nature of the revolt that we need to engineer. The revolt must be all of us standing up, demanding the interests we represent and care about, and participating, not throwing up our hands in cynical despair. We can do much better, but we need to make sure that those young, mainly young politicians coming through, they don't have the spaghetti spines of their predecessors. We need to get a movement for the Precariat, by the Precariat, that's ecologically driven, with values like that are motivating the Extinction Rebellion, that are values that are going against growth of GDP, that are going for a more convivial society, a society which has a slow time movement as its base, things like that. We have to couch our politics in a different way, thinking from the perspective of the Precariat. And the last point I want to make is this. The Precariat are not only victims. The Precariat is carrying the future. They are not subject to labour consciousness, the alienation of being in perpetual labour and therefore thinking their job is the greatest thing possible. They're actually looking for a better way of living, of working, of developing their personalities, just as the way that William Morris tried to espouse it at the end of the 19th century. And that's why I think ultimately the Precariat is going to define the art, the images, the future, and the energy. And I ultimately am optimistic that that's what's going to happen. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.